Memorials and Peacemakers. The story is told about a pastor of a large and old congregation who was at the back of the sanctuary about to begin the service when he noticed little Sam, 9 years old, visibly upset as he stared at the many names on the memorial wall there in the rear. The pastor asked Sam what he was looking at. Sam said, "All these names. Who are all these people?" The pastor replied, "Why, Sam, those are the names of the people from this church who died in the service." Sam was quiet for a minute. And then he asked with a trembling voice, "Is the 9 o'clock or the 11 o'clock?" Sam's confusion was understandable. Memorial Day is indeed to commemorate those soldiers who died in the service of their country. The observance arose during the Civil War, and there are several places who claim to have the first observance. My favorite candidate, of course, is Charleston, South Carolina, my adopted hometown, where a bunch of Union prisoners of war had died at the racetrack grounds where they were imprisoned, a place which is now called Hampton Park. And soon after the surrender at Appomattox, the former slaves of Charleston set about giving these men a decent burial and decorating their graves. The former slaves were grateful for the service of the Union soldiers, for it had led directly to their freedom. And that's the way it is supposed to work. A soldier who dies in the course of service is honored in death because his or her contribution helped to bring about something desirable in history. A revolution, the conclusion to a national struggle, repelling a foreign invasion, putting down a domestic rebellion, helping an ally, or preserving and enlarging human freedom. We have plenty of cemeteries in the world, but even all of them cannot commemorate everyone who has ever died. Out of all the people who have ever lived, we single out for special memory on this day those who have died in service, because these deaths were part of a larger enterprise. At least that's the theory. The obelisk on Main Street in Chatham commemorates the dead of the Civil War. It stands up tall and visible, like thousands of other war memorials on thousands of other village greens around the country. They say, "Pay attention to us, passers-by. Come over here and run your eyes down our names." Fewer and fewer do, of course. But at least in Chatham, we do have the annual Memorial Day walkabout, which I will be participating in tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., which visits the memorials from all the wars one at a time. The World War I and II Memorial to those lost at sea, the Korean and Vietnam Memorial, and the Civil War Memorial. Americans did not invent the tall standing stone as a war memorial. The ancient world had stelae, standing stones with inscriptions, and they are as common throughout Europe as they are here. Sometime when you have a few moments, I invite you to stand beside the Civil War obelisk in Chatham and try to imagine the reality behind the few brief words and names inscribed there. Some died on the battlefield, and for all their suffering, they were probably the lucky ones. Many of those who died were prisoners of war or in a military hospital when they died, a process which might have taken weeks or months. I can understand the gratitude of this town of Chatham toward its sons who fought to save the Union, as I can understand the gratitude of the former slaves of Charleston for the Union soldiers who brought them their freedom. It is good to memorialize the fallen in a cause which has accomplished something. For the South, it is a different story. There are decoration days in the South, but the cause the Confederate soldiers fought for was lost, and in retrospect appears lost from the beginning, though neither side thought the outcome foreordained when the fighting was going on. When we have a war whose aims or accomplishments are cloudy, that puts a cloud on the remembrance. Take the Vietnam War, a war which divided the nation as nothing had since the Civil War. When it came to make a national memorial, the Memorial Committee chose a design by Maya Lin, a young architecture student from Yale, which was different in design from any previous war memorial. Instead of a standing stone structure, she had a gash in the earth in which two horizontal walls of polished black granite intersected. The walls were inscribed with the names of each of the 58,000 U.S. service members who died in the conflict. When the design was announced, the reaction was swift and intense. Vietnam War hawks denounced it as not sufficiently heroic, as a blot on the memories of those who served. They wanted something tall to compete with the other war memorials. In effect, the design was too female. Traditionalists insisted that a war memorial stand tall. But the reaction of the public was something else. As visitors poured into the new memorial, each sought the name of a loved one. The picture on the front of the order of service captures this experience. The hands tracing the letters of the name. Rather than represent the entire nation at war, the memorial allowed a personal connection to a loved one who had died and allowed a channel for the grief of loss to flow. The Vietnam War was controversial while it was going on, and history since then has not stilled the controversy. Certainly decision makers in the 1950s and 60s, consistent with the Truman Doctrine, thought it was in the interest of the U.S. and the world that communism be contained, and American troops were committed in Korea and in Vietnam and other countries to effect that policy. International communism seemed to be like the Third Reich, a totalitarian system bent on world domination. Some of us disagreed at the time, predicting that communism as an economic and political system would collapse of its own weight, which it did at the end of the 1980s. Does that mean that the sacrifice of Americans in the Vietnam and Korean conflicts was in vain? That is a hard question to answer, and we will not agree on an answer. But we have a common loss behind the answer, and that is the beauty of Maya Lin's design. This low memorial arises out of the earth like the cries of Julia Ward Howe's Mother's Day proclamation. It does not say how great it was that these soldiers died in a noble cause, or how we are much better for their sacrifice. It says simply, they died. Its wall is a wall of grief for these people. I knew a couple of people whose names were on that wall who didn't come back from Vietnam. There's a strain in my thinking which says that war is just hell, miserably fought and suffered by the civilian populations and those soldiers too poor to buy their way out, and egged on by military industries looking to make a big profit. And all that asserted reasons for wars are just bright, shining lies. Certainly once the fighting starts, the initial justification gets lost in the fog of war. In that sense, every soldier dies in vain. And if Vietnam is still being debated 40 years later, how much more will we debate Iraq, a war started on a premise that virtually everybody now acknowledges was false, was a mistake. In the Vietnam era, John Kerry, now our Secretary of State, asked the famous question, how do you tell a mother that her son was the last one to die for a mistake? How much more insistently will that question linger over those who died in Iraq? Some of you may feel it is a dishonoring of the dead to continue to question a war after it has been fought. I am sympathetic to this view. The time to oppose the war is when the statesmen and politicians can do something about reversing its direction. It is unfair to take out one's opposition to a war on the servicemen who gave their lives. The justifications or lack of justifications for the war should not undermine the appreciation we all owe to the sacrifice of those who fought it. And particularly those baby boomers opposed to the Vietnam War, as I was, did not do enough to honor those who fought it, who came back home. What I also found myself wishing is that there were monuments to peacemakers as prominent as the monuments to warriors. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." That's one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. We honor the soldiers who fought in the good wars, or on the good side, who supposedly made possible some socially desirable goals like independence from Great Britain, the preservation of the Union, abolition of slavery, preservation of liberal democracy in the face of the Third Reich. We also honor the service of soldiers in wars that are more morally ambiguous. But what about those who made it possible for us to avoid war altogether? I think of our second president, John Adams, who was also our first Unitarian president. Throughout his administration, he was under great pressure to make war on France. Now, if you've never visited it, let me tell you about a wonderful online resource for Unitarian and Universalist history, the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, or DUUB. You should put that in Google. You can get it there. The entries are all written by contemporary Jews. Anyhow, here's how my colleague Wesley Formatka describes Adams's avoidance of war with France. Quote, during Adams's administration, the United States was in conflict with its former ally, France. French privateers captured 300 American ships, claiming the cargo to be British war material. In 1797, Adams attempted negotiation, but the French demanded bribes. He recalled the envoys and outfitted an effective navy. Adams knew, however, that the new republic was unprepared to fight a major war. He sacrificed his popularity within his party to settle the quasi-war with France by the Convention of 1800, which was secretly negotiated by his son, John Quincy Adams. Adams later said, I desire no other inscription over my gravestone than, here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. Unquote. Where is the Adams Monument? If we are to honor soldiers who fought to keep America safe, we should also honor statesmen who fought to keep other soldiers from going to war. In more modern times, I want to lift up the example of George Mitchell, who had a distinguished career as the U.S. Senator from Maine, rose to the position of Majority Leader and then President Pro Tem of the Senate. But after he retired, President Clinton called him back into the service by naming him as Special Envoy to the Irish peace talks. The unresolved tensions from the Irish Civil War in the early 1920s had flared up in the early 1970s into a hot guerrilla war fought by the Irish Republican Army against Northern Irish Protestant and British interests, both on the Emerald Isle and in England. Mitchell got all sides to agree to a framework of nonviolence, and grueling negotiations finally resulted in a peace accord on Good Friday, 1998, which effectively ended the conflict. There have been other ceasefires before, but Mitchell got the parties to agree on a political solution, which, despite occasional flare-ups, has held firm for more than a decade. More than 3,000 people were killed during the Troubles, and this Arab-American diplomat from Maine has put that chapter behind two nations. I would like to see a large monument to George Mitchell somewhere. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. We have to be careful here. If we just honor peacemakers, what do we do with Neville Chamberlain, who negotiated peace with Adolf Hitler in the late 1930s by allowing him to keep the Sudetenland, the territory he had just seized? Though Chamberlain announced that he had secured peace in our time when he returned from Munich, Hitler had other plans, and eventually Britain was drawn into the war. But the lesson of Chamberlain is not that we should never negotiate with aggressive foreign powers, but that attempts to make peace often do not succeed on the first try. What Chamberlain's example says to me is that for peace to prevail, it must be coupled with justice. The horror show that was World War I brought about a peace treaty at Versailles that was vindictive and placed Germany under a crushing load of debt, which in turn gave the German people a grievance, which Hitler nursed effectively in rising to power. Blessed are the peacemakers. Jesus is sometimes referred to as the Prince of Peace, especially around Christmas time, despite the fact that he said, I have come not to bring peace but a sword. In that spirit, I propose another class of monuments. Monuments to troublemakers. Troublemakers are the people who bring us closer to justice by reminding us of how far away we are from a just state. Frederick Douglass was a troublemaker. Martin Luther King was a troublemaker. Malcolm X was a troublemaker. Jesus was a troublemaker. On the Memorial Day weekend, I wish to briefly lift up two UU troublemakers who deserve monuments. The first is Aiden Ballou, the author of the first hymn we sang this morning. A distant cousin of Hosea Ballou, the first theologian of Universalism, Aiden was both a Universalist and a Unitarian minister, and was the leader of the Utopian community at Hopedale, about 60 miles west of here. What Ballou is best remembered for is his idea of Christian pacifism. According to Aiden Ballou's entry in the Dictionary of UU Biography, quote, in 1838, Ballou converted to a form of pacifism called Christian non-resistance. Acting with a few ministerial colleagues and some laymen, Ballou composed the Standard of Practical Christianity in 1839. The signatories announced their withdrawal from, quote, the governments of the world, which they judged contaminated by dependence on the use of force to maintain order. While they could not participate in government, neither would they rebel nor resist any of the ordinances by physical force. We cannot employ carnal weapons nor any physical violence whatsoever, they proclaimed, not even for the preservation of our lives. We cannot render evil for evil, nor do otherwise than love our enemies, unquote. Ballou's ideas on nonviolence were taken up by Leo Tolstoy in Russia, and through Tolstoy influenced Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The whole notion that one can struggle for justice without actually succumbing to violence had its origins in this gentle man. Actually, there is a monument to Aiden Ballou in Hopedale, in the Blackstone River Valley, for I've seen it in front of the UU Church when I preached there. If you're in the neighborhood, go look it up. And then someday, maybe we'll have a monument to Tim DeChristopher, a contemporary troublemaker. Tim was a nature guide in Utah and a student at the university there when he learned that the federal government was going to auction off oil and gas leases in some of the most pristine mountain areas that he took his people through. DeChristopher went to the auction and was a successful bidder for 22 parcels of land totaling $1.8 million. He had no intention of paying for them. Ironically, the incoming Obama administration canceled the sale anyway, but this did not stop its Justice Department from prosecuting Tim, and he served 4 years in federal prison for this act of civil disobedience. Maybe some of you heard it yesterday on Bill Moyers on NPR. He is proud of what he did, and he's decided what else would make sense after you've done that? To go into the ministry. He will be starting next fall at my alma mater, Harvard Divinity School. Incidentally, he is a member of the Salt Lake City UU Church. Theodore Parker said it originally. Martin Luther King picked it up, and now it is stitched into a rug at the Obama White House. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. But it doesn't just bend on its own accord, my friends. Many hands must bend it toward justice. Some of those hands carried rifles and today sleep in graves, and they are properly honored on Memorial Day. But we also honor the peacemakers, those who taught until the underlying conflict could be resolved without violence. And we also honor the troublemakers, those who remind us that peace does not mean a cessation of conflict, but it means a struggle for a better world. Amen.